Welcome, 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 and two more welcomes. Welcome, welcome to everybody joining us, part of our continuing series where we talk to reporters, writers, activists, professors, adventurers, and philosophers. Anybody on the left, anybody on the right who want to provide their perspective unedited and unaltered for you so that you could do this thing that was popular back when I was in high school called thinking for yourself. Maybe it'll come back, maybe it won't. With us today, it's Iskra Fileva. She's the associate professor, associate director at the Center of Values and Social Policy, the Department of Philosophy, College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Colorado, Boulder. Associate professor, philosophy at the University of Colorado, Boulder. In her academic work, she specializes in moral psychology and issues at the intersection of philosophy, psychology, and psychiatry. The focus of her current research is on the connections and tensions between conscious and unconscious motivation, the nature of moral emotions, and the boundary between bad character and personality disorders. She is, however, interested in all things human, how and what we remember, how we achieve intimacy, what makes some people good at relating to others, why we misunderstand each other, why we fear death, whether adults understand a child's mind, and many others. She enjoys writing for a non-academic audience and has previously written for the New York Times. She joined the department in fall 2014. Prior to coming to the University of Colorado Boulder, she taught at several universities, most recently the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. Specializes in the intersection of philosophy, psychiatry, and psychology. She also does work in aesthetics and epistemology. Her work has appeared in a number of journals, including Australian Journal of Philosophy, Philosopher's Imprint, Philosophical Studies, and Synthese. She's currently working on a book manuscript provisionally entitled Character and Values. In that manuscript, she develops a novel conception of character and uses that conception to tackle various problems in the philosophy of character, such as character fragmentation, the role of brute psychological facts in the construction of character, and the boundary between flawed characters and psychiatric conditions, such as the narcissistic personality disorder. Seen that. She's also the editor of Questions of Character, an interdisciplinary volume of essays featuring work by leading philosophers, psychologists, and social scientists published by Oxford University Press in 2016. This is also the book that was mentioned about her, a collection of 26 new essays on character from first-rate scholars in philosophy, psychology, economics, and law. The essays are elegantly written and combine a forceful argumentation with original ideas on a wide range of questions such as, is Aristotle's theory of character and moral character, etc. And we were going to have a general discussion today. But before we get into that, let's check and see how well I did. Professor, did I say anything wrong? Is there anything I need to correct?
No, that was great. There was just one journal name. It's Australasian Journal, not Australian Journal.
Oh, Australasian Journal.
Okay.
Sorry. Those are two different things. Yes. So you.
Thank you very much.
I appreciate it. So you have a background in psychology, psychiatry, philosophy. I wanted to ask you, as we talked before, what is the actual underlying psychology? What drives people to polarize? Coming from your background, well, obviously you've seen that America has become very polarized. Obviously you saw January 6th. Most people think that wasn't good. We've never seen something like that before. I don't want to get into exactly how we got here, but I would like to do a dive with you on what motivates people to join two tribes politically and to, I don't know if cast off or denigrate's the right word, but place less weight on other personalities and put a lot of weight on this one particular one. We've heard that people are now more likely to identifying yourself by political party has gone up to the level of polarization as identifying yourself as by race. Used to hold a few years ago. There's a couple studies doing that. How do we get to this point psychologically? What motivates Americans to do this? Don't people engaging in this polarization realize they're becoming kind of nasty people and they're only tearing down the country? What's going on in their minds? Please walk us through this.
Yes, well, these are very good questions. So maybe I would start by kind of mentioning what I take to be some aspects of polarization that one might be interested in or concerned about. So, one kind of feature of polarization is just the divergence between the endpoints on the spectrum, right? So we might talk about polarization when the extremes are getting farther apart. Another feature, I think, of polarization is what I would call the disappearing spectrum. Now, sometimes people prefer to talk about the disappearing middle or the disappearing moderates or something like that. I really prefer to talk about it in terms of a disappearing spectrum and just spectrum in general, because I think pretty much anything that we're interested in regarding human behavior and attitudes, as well as human traits, can be sort of mapped on in such a way that we get a spectrum, basically. So there are no big gaps when you choose any kind of trait, right? Let's say loyalty or conscientiousness or agreeableness, and there is no reason why you would expect big gaps when it comes to political orientations, right? So if people's political convictions work like other things, like other human things, then we would expect that, if you plot all of the political attitudes that people have on some kind of graph, you will get every kind of spot pretty much occupied, right?
Oh,
so you would
okay.
get some extreme people, you would get people in the middle, you would get people anywhere sort of in between on both sides. And so you might think of the second feature of polarization as this sort of effect of the disappearing of the spectrum, right? Where everyone somehow moves to one end of the spectrum or the other. And this is, in a way, a distribution that is highly, highly unusual. That is just not how things work in general with regard to any sort of human attitude or type of action or anything like that. And so it's interesting, partly for that reason. And then I think the third feature, and this may be what commentators have been concerned with to some extent, maybe most, is what I might call the mission creep of political convictions, where, you have political differences, let's say, with people, but then they start to affect areas of life that are not political.
Right.
Right? Like the selling of jeans or of yogurt or any other product that should exist in accordance with its own logic, and it somehow it just seems that it doesn't. So people would use political considerations in making those kinds of choices that would normally be based on very different considerations that are really not political ones. So I would say that's kind of the third feature. And I don't think that there's a lot of evidence for sort of the extremes drifting very far apart. I think if you sort of look back at history, in the US it used to be that some people supported slavery, and some people wanted to abolish it. So that seems like a big, big gap. And we don't, I think, have anything comparable now. So I don't think we have more polarization when it comes to that first feature. But then there are these other sorts of features that I mentioned, the disappearing spectrum and the mission creep. And I think those might be the things that people are concerned with and that they want to sort of understand better. And so then the question is, well, why is that? Why is the, sort of the spectrum disappearing, and why is politics affecting all these other areas of life that have nothing to do with it? And you might think, look, this really is a very good question, because if you sort of, think about it, you might say, well, these are obviously bad things. So when we want to avoid them, but then you have to ask, well, who's doing that? Who's doing the polarizing? I mean, if everyone agrees that these are bad things, then wouldn't it be very easy to just not do it, right?
Good point.
Say yes.
I love that point. Good point. Oh, please keep going, Professor. I'm picking up everything you're putting down.
Thank you. So if you look at any other issue where, we seem to just agree that something is bad, right? Let's say we all agree that at some point at least we came to an agreement that corporal punishment of children is bad.
Right.
And, and because we all saw it that way, we just stop tolerating it, and now it's virtually non-existent. And it used to be not simply, kind of existent, but really endorsed. There was that existed in schools, that existed at homes. So why is polarizing sort of not like that? I mean, if we all think that it's a bad thing, then why are we sort of doing it? And I guess I would like to touch on maybe what I take to be sort of two sides of the issue. There is a kind of internal side, what polarization is doing for people, and there is the conditions that might enable polarization. And what I want to kind of suggest about the internal side is that people get significant psychological benefits. So my best guess when it comes to the question of why it is that we polarize is that at least some people really like it. And so why is that? And what I would kind of say in response is that there are several reasons why people might like it. One is polarization is a sort of symptom of a kind of attempt to come up with a simple story of what is going on. So if you want some kind of narrative that is really simple, what the sort children get in fairy tales, where, you can just divide the world in good and bad actors, or good and bad things that people have done, polarization would be the result of that, basically. And people might want a simple story for all kinds of psychological reasons. Simple stories are easier to understand. They are more comfortable, at least for a certain kind of person. They do not require people to entertain mixed emotions, and emotional ambivalence can be painful. They do not sort of require you to confront the complexity of the world. So just to take, let's say, a simple, example, there are probably a lot of unreported cases of sexual harassment and rape in the world. And there are also some false rape and sexual harassment accusations.
I've seen that.
And, it's a little bit psychologically difficult to hold these two things together. They don't strictly contradict each other because the world is just a messy, complicated place. But from the point of view of a story and a narrative, they are in tension because then you don't know what story to tell yourself, about yourself or society, and so on. And so it's, to some extent, it's kind of natural and comforting to pick one of these and just focus on that and dismiss the other as an aberration or as something that we don't have to worry about or something that's just detracting from the main issue. And I think you can basically say very similar things about a lot of other sort of issues that polarize people. So this is, I think, one thing that is an important psychological benefit. It's this sort of narrative that is simpler, that is kind of easier to grasp, that helps make sense of things. Otherwise, maybe the world just gets to be too confusing. So that is sort of one psychological benefit, I think, that people get. Another benefit has to do with status. So if you can divide these sort of actors into good and bad and align yourself with the good ones, or the ones that you have determined are the good ones, then you can feel better, about yourself. And that's extremely important. We're status-seeking creatures. We just look for the approval of others, for our own approval. It's really difficult, actually, to get rid of the desire of humans for status. I mean, I would mention as a side note that people have found that, even those who go into the practice of meditation with the intention of quieting the ego, very often turn their own practice into something that can benefit them in the way they think about themselves. So they start thinking that they're more enlightened than other people, they're more spiritual than other people, that they are aware of things that other people are not aware of, and so on. So even when the explicit goal is to attain some kind of more selfless state, the ego, as Freud once taught us, has its needs, and it just starts looking for ways of satisfying them anywhere it can, basically. So I think that's sort of another benefit that people get. And then I think another related one maybe just has to do with identity. I think if particularly, and this is where we might be crossing over into sort of the question of the external conditions of polarization, but particularly if you sort of live in a society in which you do not have an identity that is pre-made for you the way identities used to be historically, right? So I mean, historically, people would have almost their whole life trajectory mapped out for them on the day of their birth, right? If they were born in a carpenter's family, then they will be expected to be a carpenter, and they'll be expected to have their parents' religious convictions, and so on and so forth. And they didn't really have to think much about who they are, what kind of person they want to be, what sort of identity they want to adopt. And that, of course, has many sort of disadvantages. People have less autonomy, there's less authenticity, and so on in those kinds of situations. But one advantage for a lot of people is that it kind of takes away the pressure of making choices for oneself. And in a pluralistic society, you have to make choices. And very often, it's very difficult to say who you really are, what you're really standing up for. And sort of picking political groups is, I think, one way and sort of an important way to answer some of those questions. You know, to have some sort of identity, to be someone, to stand up for something. And this is easier to do if you polarize. You know, because then you don't have to tell some kind of a complex story where you don't even know what you're standing up for anymore. You have a very simple one that is sort of clear and understandable and relatable. And so all of these things, I think, are really important psychological benefits that people get. And if you sort of think about that, you might start getting a sense of, well, why is it that we do it? You know, if we all agree that it's a bad thing, why don't we just, stop polarizing? And then, I will maybe say in a minute something about what I think about the external conditions, but I fear I'm talking on for too long.
Let's move on to the external conditions. I like everything you said. It makes a lot of sense to me. The reference that I kept thinking in my head was a book by ex-German philosopher known as Erich Fromm. Erich Fromm wrote the book Escape from Freedom. He was a German citizen who was living in America, and I think he was a psychologist or anthropologist. And he was trying to understand how the Germans had engaged in Nazism and all the destructive horrors from that. And so he went and interviewed them. And what he found was that people embraced Nazism because the period before Nazism was complex. There were many parties. The economy wasn't doing well. Germany was not doing well, and they lost a war. And then they had a massive recession and inflation. And then Hitler comes along and goes, it's not that we did something wrong. It's that we're the victims. We're the victims, guys. They're picking on us. Why? Because we're so awesome. And what you need to do is give me all the power, and I'll make life simple and easy for you and awesome. And they did. And for a while that worked. You couldn't speak up. You couldn't, argue, but jobs improved. They started wearing better clothes. They started feeling like they had a sense of pride about themselves. You were just giving up these things like the ability to express your opinion, the ability to say that's wrong when you see something horrible. But he said people loved it. They loved giving up their freedom, which sounds anathema to Americans because it made life easier to understand. That screams out to me when everything I heard you say.
Yeah, so this is, I think it's a very important point. One thing that I would sort of note as a follow-up is that we do not see this kind of polarization in totalitarian systems. And there are, of course, various reasons for this. One obvious one has to do with the external conditions and censorship and so on. But I don't think that we have much by way of evidence for a need to polarize in a totalitarian system. And it's possible that this is precisely because the difficulty of choice has been taken care of.
Right.
People have very few choices, so they don't actually need to polarize in order to solve these remaining difficulties with the pressure of freedom. And I think, our attitudes toward freedom are really quite complex. On the one hand, it is something that we are extremely attracted to. And one way in which we sort of know this is that in their imaginations and fantasies, people try all kinds of things, right? I think this is why people like video games, why they consume fiction, because they actually want the freedom to try out all kinds of different lifestyles and situations. So people really want to try out all sorts of things, but they want to do it in a way that is less costly. And I mean, in the case of fiction, it's basically costless, right? Because nothing real happens. So you can play a game where, maybe you play a very bad character, or you just have a profession that's very different from the one you have in real life, or you identify with a protagonist who's very different from you, and you can get the sorts of benefits of trying out new things in this sort of free way. And so I think that this is very powerful evidence that we really like, freedom in one way. We are interested in it. We're attracted to it. It is very seductive in many ways. I think we also really like the idea of it. So maybe I'll sort of give an example from my practice. If I ask my students, do you prefer to pick your own topic for an essay, or do you prefer that I give you a couple of topics to choose from? Most of them would say that they prefer to pick their own topic. But if I make that the rule, and I basically set up the assignment so that everyone can pick their own topic, a whole bunch of students come to me and say, I don't know what to write about. Can you give me a topic? So they like the idea of picking their own topic. Okay. But the actual picking of a topic,
right,
well, that is a rather different thing, and that is rather more difficult.
Right.
And so I think all of this really sort of supports a possible connection between a way to avoid having to make a lot of choices, particularly in a situation in which you do have many choices. Society is freer, it is more pluralistic, all kinds of things are open, and life just gets to be confusing. There is almost a kind of paralysis sometimes where, you see people who are in their late 30s and they still haven't figured out what they want to be, basically, when they grow up, because so many choices are open, right?
Right.
You would, you see what happens. And because when that's the case, it becomes difficult to have any sort of anchor and stability for your identity. You've been trying all these different gigs, people maybe try to be a yoga instructor, and then they try to be a freelance writer, and they try to have a Substack, and, all kinds of different things. At some point, you need something to tie all of these things together. You need to identify in some particular way. And so I think basically aligning oneself with a group is a sort of relatively easy and relatively costless way to do it, because another feature of the sort of group identity and group choices is the phenomenon of diffusion of responsibility, right? So it's, if your group does something, you're responsible for that, but not in the way in which you would be if you and you alone were doing something.
Right.
So the cost of accountability is basically really lowered when it's a group that's doing it. And then there are many other advantages. So, because it's a group, if the group is doing something that is perceived as misguided, for instance, by outsiders, you don't even have to expose yourself to being held accountable, because you can just try to avoid conversations with outsiders. You just try to talk to other members of the group to find excuses for what the group did. And so it's even less costly than it would be if the group truly was trying to take responsibility for these sorts of group behaviors, which would already come with a diffusion of responsibility because there are multiple actors. But then, in addition to that, we have the phenomenon of not even, wanting the group to be held accountable at all, basically being resistant to objections that someone might levy against the group. So yes, all of these things. And I think it's actually a nice segue into the question of the external conditions
Sure.
of polarization. One thing that I would say about this is I think maybe the way in which we exchange information currently is, so far as I can tell, the biggest contributing factor. So what has happened in the age of the internet is that, for better or worse, and I think it's mostly for the better, but of course, as we said, the world is a complicated place, and good things are not all good. So mostly for the better, but sometimes for the worse, everyone has a voice on the internet.
Yeah.
So if you compare that to a time when there are some major news outlets that try to maintain some kind of dignity and nobility, you basically see the difference. I mean, there are certain ways of presenting information which would be avoided in an old, respectable outlet that's trying to maintain its reputation.
True.
But when you have everyone have a voice, anything can be said, sort of no matter how extreme. And then I think what happens, and just no matter how offensive and so on. And I think what happens basically when that's the case is several things, but one of them is a phenomenon that is known from the psychology of group dynamics, which is when you have groups that lean a certain way, after exchanging information, the group basically tends to become more extreme in its leanings, more extreme than the initial inclination, so the individual members were. And if you have a situation in which these kinds of more extreme voices are heard and potentially amplified, and I think this is the second feature, the way information is exchanged, it is just somehow more exciting to share more extreme sort of opinions, because they tend to generate more interest and more responses, more reactions, more emotions, more clicks. And so those voices basically tend to get amplified in a situation in which everyone could speak, basically. And to be clear, I really love the fact that everyone, can speak. So I think on the whole, this is a very good thing, but this is one sort of possibly to some extent predictable outcome.
Right.
That there would be these sorts of amplifications of the most extreme voices, and that would lead to the polarization of groups. And one thing that I would also kind of mention here is it's not obvious to me that, polarization is something to be solved. It's pleased to the way in which many people are thinking about it. Because we sort of have to think about what the costs and benefits are. So now we've mentioned a number of psychological benefits for people, which are not insignificant. And, there are, unfortunately, human psychology is such that sometimes things that may be in some way objectionable are in other ways beneficial, right? So take gossip, for instance, right? So gossip seems objectionable morally, ethically. Aristotle's theory on a virtue is probably not a person who ever gossips, but gossip is also very pleasurable to a lot of people. It might also lead to sort of having more intimate conversations, to people relating to each other and so on. That's not true of everyone, of course. Some people prefer to get together and, talk about modern cosmology or coding or whatever it may be. But some people, prefer to gossip. And so it's not clear what the effects of gossip are on balance, right? Because even though it may be ethically problematic and morally problematic, there are also psychological benefits that at least some people get. And so it may be that something similar is true of polarization, right? It may be that, there are all kinds of costs, but it's not clear that we can sort of avoid them basically without taking the benefits away. And the benefits might be sort of important and not insignificant. I'm actually now reminded of that line from a poem by the poet Rilke, which I'm afraid I might butcher it, but it was something like, "Don't take my demons away, because my angels might flee with them."
What would be the top two positive things of being a highly polarized country?
So I don't know about the positive things for the country as a whole, but there are positive things for the individuals who engage in polarization.
Oh, sure. Yeah, right? Yeah, psychologically,
psychological benefits.
Yeah,
yes. This is what I had in mind. Yeah, not that there would be necessarily benefits for the country as a whole. There are clearly, sort of costs for society, and you might sort of think about, whether it is possible to somehow keep the psychological benefits for individuals while disposing of the cost for society.
Interesting.
And it's not really obvious how to do that, right? I mean, ideally, you might say, well, we don't have to polarize. We can have discussions, and we can have sort of what Mill calls the market of ideas. We can have different people advocating for different positions, and we try to persuade each other, and we see which ideas win in argument. And wouldn't that be so much better? And I think from the point of view of just discovering the moral truth, it would be. But whether it would be better on the whole depends at least partly on whether people's psychological needs would be fulfilled. Now, one thing that I would note from, the finding from psychological research is, the people who study group conflict suggest, or at least some of them, that the way in which groups tend to stop polarizing is when they have a common goal. So there is a very famous and frequently cited study from the 1950s on group conflict. It was done at some park, which I believe was called Robber's Cave. And what the psychologists did there was they brought these boys who I believe were maybe age 10 and 11, and they set up these two camps, but the two camps didn't really know for a while that the other camp existed. So one of them was called the Rattlers, and the other one was called the Eagles. And so they didn't know, they each didn't know that the other camp existed. And at first they would just, for a few days, each camp would just exist on its own. All sorts of, relationships would form, and they would have common activities and so on. And then they were told about the other team. And what happened in the subsequent days was basically polarization, animosity, an us versus them mentality and dynamic. And then the psychologists tried different ways to get the boys to overcome that. They tried having them talk to each other and just be exposed to each other, and that seemed not to work. But the thing that did work was common goal. So I believe one goal was seeing a movie. So they were told that they can all see a movie. They were given a choice between several movies. I believe they had picked a movie called Treasure Island. But they were told that they would all sort of have to chip in order to see this movie, and they did. And they did not even complain. So it turned out that two boys from one group, or maybe more than two, I think it was two, were homesick, so they couldn't contribute. But the other group did not complain about this, even though they ended up sort of, contributing more. And that helped ease tensions. Another sort of common goal that they worked toward was getting water. They had to get, I believe, drinking water together. And I don't remember what the psychologists had contrived to do, to get the boys to, to maybe believe that they didn't have enough water or something. But the same thing happened. They worked together, and that decreased tension. And that seems to me a very natural way to overcome divisions. That is, in a way, sort of psychologically natural and psychologically healthy for people. It's sort of having some sort of common goal. Hopefully it's not going to be a common enemy, right? Because sometimes that works as well. So if the country is all of a sudden attacked, if we got invaded by some other foreign actor, then most likely almost everyone will come together. And if there was an alien invasion, then all humans will come together.
Right.
So that's, so having a common enemy is one way. I remember a line from a fairy tale that was something like the cat and the dog work together to defeat the cook. That's sort of one way, and that's maybe not so good for the world, even though you get cohesion at the national level. But what was more optimistic about the psychological findings was that you don't actually need a common enemy, you just need a common goal. And so maybe that's a way for people to engage in some sort of activity where they do get these benefits. They can, all of a sudden, maybe feel like a productive member of this bigger group. They get to enjoy just the benefit of being in a bigger group, because they see that their smaller group cannot achieve the goal that they have, but that if they joined efforts with the other team, then they well can achieve that goal. And so I think in these kinds of cases, you see people overcome polarization. I would mention as a side note that the study on these little boys sort of suggests to me that the tendency to polarize is quite deeply ingrained. If we can see it in these very young people in that context, completely unprovoked. It has nothing to do with prior politics. It's basically almost for no reason. It's if any one of them had been put in the other group, then they would be rooting for the other group, basically. Right?
Interesting.
So it's not because there is anything about your group that is some kind of essential characteristic that that you align with. It's just that happened to be your group. You were told you were one of the Eagles or you were one of the Rattlers,
right?
And there you go. So if it can happen that way, I think it's really sort of quite deeply ingrained. Now, I think.
Just real quick, if I may,
yes.
we have 5 minutes left, so I got to go in 5 minutes. Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay. You were going to make another point.
Yes. So I was going to say that in politics, it may be a little difficult to find a similarly natural way to overcome divisions because people, do not have obvious common goals. They really sort of tend to, want different things. My best bet for how polarization might be eased and tensions, might be eased would be having people think about whether maybe they do have common goals. So one way to think about it might be this, okay, let's observe the fact that, we have these differences, and a common goal might just be something like, how can we live given that? Let's just try to figure out together what we can do. Is it possible to get what the benefits were psychologically in terms of status and identity of mudslinging at the other side, but without doing that? Right. So maybe something like having more local autonomy is a possibility, right? Maybe having more autonomy in the hands of local legislators, so that, if California wants to have a healthcare system that is very different from the healthcare system that Texas wants to have, they can somehow have different healthcare systems. And maybe maybe that can be a sort of common goal, just sort of figuring out ways in which everyone can basically get what they want.
That makes sense. I wanted to ask you a question I ask every professor. It goes like this: you're not you, you're not me, you're a third-party person. And they're watching this interview, and boy, did they learn a lot. They learned a lot. But it's a week after they watched the interview, and they're struggling to remember everything that was covered this interview, but they're saying to themselves, boy, there was this one thing the professor said. And it's 5 days after I finished watching that interview. And while I struggle to remember everything else, I can't stop thinking about this one thing the professor said. What is that one thing you want a random person you'll never meet to not be able to stop thinking about 5 days after watching the interview?
I suppose the one thing that I would sort of single out would just be the question of, do you really believe that polarization is overall bad.
Interesting. Or is there benefits that could be perceived from it? Right? Is it all bad,
Yes.
or is there benefits?
How do you? Yes, because we sort of tend to think of it in terms of its cost, but as I mentioned, if there were be just completely rational, and that's not to say that it's not possible. I mean, sometimes we do irrational things, but it's not clear to me that it is. It might simply be a suboptimal way to achieve certain goals, to get certain psychological benefits that we may be able to achieve in a better way. But if we simply try to take away this way of getting the benefit without having an alternative, we might just end up taking away the benefit.
Oh, right. Kill all the bacteria. Whoops, you accidentally killed the important good bacteria we need for our stomachs to work well. Well, I got rid of it all. Yeah, but not all bacteria is bad. Did you bother to think about the benefits?
Yeah, so maybe I can give actually an analogy from psychiatry. So cases in which, for instance, people engage in self-harming behaviors. Let's say people with borderline personality disorder who sometimes just inflict self-harm. You could try to get people to stop doing that, but what you have to recognize is this is a way of coping. And if you don't give them an alternative way of coping, you can get them to stop doing that, but then they're stuck with this pain and they have no coping mechanism, basically.
Yeah.
Now, if you can think of a better way of coping, and sometimes people have come up with alternatives, like holding ice cubes apparently work. If you have a better sort of solution, go ahead. But if you're just sort of trying to get rid of the cost without replacing the benefit or giving a replacement way of achieving the benefit, I think you might end up making things worse.
Interesting. Well, I hope you found it was a fair interview. No gotcha journalism. Do you have anybody you could recommend? Do you know anybody in academia or political science or maybe just activism who might be willing to talk about why are we polarized as Americans? How did we get here? You don't have to name anybody, but we always ask. Try to keep the conversation going.
Well, a while ago, I heard an interesting interview with someone named Arnold Kling. I believe he's an economist, and he had written a book called, I think, The Three Languages of Politics.
Okay.
And it was about the ways in which progressives, conservatives, and libertarians describe the world. And what he was suggesting is that they sort of speak in a different language. So libertarians see everything in terms of coercion and freedom, and for conservatives, virtue and authority versus
the
lack thereof, and for people who are liberal and progressive, it's things like equality versus inequality and exploitation versus lack of it.
Right.
And so these would be sort of different prisms through which people see the world and interpret events and each other's actions. And I thought it was quite insightful and an interesting interview, and I think he would be an interesting guest to talk to.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that.
You're very welcome.
We'll stop here. I want to say thank you for coming out. I want to say thank you for doing a deep dive on the psychology. I had heard parts of what you had said, but I'd never heard it explained that well, that holistically, with all the different parts. neatly matched in to make a coherent story. So that was a lot of learning for me. For those watching, I didn't understand it that well till this interview today. So thank you. That really helps us understand. And that's why I do these things, so other people can understand. I really appreciate that. I really appreciate you giving some ideas on how we could fix this. And I just wanted to say thank you. And I know your time's valuable. I will email you a copy of the video very soon, I promise, today. And I want to say thank you for coming out, and I really appreciate your time, Professor.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'll email you soon. Thank you.